7:15 or a little later, but I think we'll go ahead and start just to make sure we have time for questions and dialogue at the end. I appreciate everyone getting up so early on this beautiful morning, and hope you'll find that it's worth doing. I want to talk this morning about the transformative power of what's called lifestyle medicine. And lifestyle medicine is the idea of using lifestyle changes not only to prevent disease, which we all know, but to actually treat it and even reverse it. And there's increasing evidence that these simple changes in lifestyle have incredibly powerful outcomes and how quickly they can occur. I'm writing a new book called Undo It. It's based on the idea that my favorite key on the computer keyboard has always been the undo button. I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we had something like that in our lives, and now we do. And what we're finding is that the simple program of a whole foods plant-based diet with moderate amounts of fat and refined carbs, various stress management techniques including yoga and meditation, moderate exercise, and what may be the most powerful intervention, what we call psychosocial support, or just a euphemism for love and intimacy, that these simple changes are so powerful. And as I mentioned briefly yesterday, we've been using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures to prove the power of this very low-tech and low-cost and often ancient intervention. And if we reduce it down even further, it's eat well, move more, stress less, love more. Boom, that's it. And again, many people have a hard time believing that these simple changes can have such powerful impacts. In some cases, even more so than drugs and surgery, at a fraction of the cost, and the only side effects are good ones. U.S. News and World Report has rated our diet #1 for heart health for every year since 2011 when they started rating that by a panel of experts. So that was a nice independent validation. The guiding principle of all of my work has been a very simple idea, radical in the sense of getting to the root of something, which is what's the cause. And what we're finding is that if we can treat the cause, how powerful the healing can be. But so often in our medical training, we're taught to mop up the floor instead of turn off the faucet. When as I mentioned yesterday, when people get put on cholesterol-lowering drugs or drugs to lower their blood sugar or their blood pressure, and they say, "Doctor, how long do I have to take these?" The doctor usually says, "Forever." It's like, how long do I have to mop up the floor? But if we can turn off the faucet, if we can treat the cause, which to a much larger degree than we had once realized are the lifestyle choices that we make each day, we're finding that our bodies often have a remarkable capacity to begin healing, and much more quickly than we had once realized. So what I want to go through with you today are 40 years of research that we've done showing using these very simple, using these very high-tech, expensive, state-of-the-art scientific measures, this being a Techonomy conference, to prove the power of these very simple and low-tech and low-cost interventions. And everything I'm going to share with you today was thought impossible before we were able to show that it in fact was. And that to me is part of the value of science, is to demonstrate what is possible, to reframe that. And by doing so, to give many people new hope and new choices that they didn't have before. And this isn't just an incremental, oops, I don't know what I just hit here. This isn't just an incremental change. It's a disruptive technology, the same way that an iPhone or a Tesla or something similar. It's really shaking things up in a time when I think medicine really needs to be shaken up. And then after doing this work for 40 years, it's finally the right idea at the right time because of a convergence of forces. On the one hand, the limitations of drugs and surgery are becoming increasingly well documented. And as I'll talk about, studies have shown that getting your blood sugar down with drugs doesn't prevent the horrible complications of type 2 diabetes, but getting them down with lifestyle, you can prevent all of them. And today, half the population is diabetic or pre-diabetic. And it's not just in this country, it's now pandemic around the world. Men who have early stage prostate cancer, a major 10-year study, randomized trial of the New England Journal of Medicine last November, found that men who did nothing, who had early stage prostate cancer, lived just as long as those who had surgery or radiation. And yet the treatments left many men either impotent or incontinent or both, kind of maiming guys in the most personal ways for not much benefit at huge economic and personal costs. And yet when a guy has a biopsy and knows that they have prostate cancer going, they want to do something. And just sitting and waiting under a sword of Damocles for it to drop is not what a lot of guys want to do, and even if the treatment is worse than the disease, because most men are going to die with prostate cancer rather than from it. But so we give people a third alternative. We did a randomized trial, which I'll talk about, showing that we can slow, stop, and even reverse the progression in men with early stage prostate cancer, and by extension, women with breast cancer, by making these same lifestyle changes. And so it's not only diabetes and prostate cancer, but also heart disease. There was a There have now been 8 randomized trials have shown that in men and women who are stable, which is most people who get stents and angioplasties, that they don't prolong life, they don't prevent heart attacks. And that a major study came out in The Lancet just a few days ago, that where they, I don't know how they got this through the Human Studies Committee, but they randomized people with heart disease who were going to get stents. Half of them actually got the stents, the other half, they put the catheter in, but they didn't put the stent in. It was like sham surgery. And they found that the reduction in angina was the same in both groups, because cardiologists who said, well, okay, even if it doesn't help people live longer or prevent heart attacks, at least it'll help reduce their angina. And they found that it didn't even do that. And yet we found there's over a greater than 90% reduction in the frequency of angina in most people who go through our program. And it occurs in the first few days to the first few weeks, again, because these mechanisms are so dynamic. So I think after doing this for so many years, it's finally the right idea at the right time. Also, President Obama appointed me to this White House Advisory Commission on Preventive Medicine and Integrative Health. And after 7 years, we released our report last month. And there's a major section in there on lifestyle medicine, which again shows how it's coming of age. And just last week, The Lancet did a major, what they call Moonshot Commission, to be part of Joe Biden's Moonshot Commission on cancer. And there's a major section on lifestyle medicine in there that I co-wrote as well. Again, just showing that this is an idea whose time has finally come. So I started doing this work years ago, 40 years ago, when I did my first study showing that heart disease was reversible. And it was a series of studies leading up to what was called the Lifestyle Heart Trial, which was the most definitive study. And these were men and women who had severe, moderate, most of them had pretty bad heart disease. And we randomized them into 2 groups. One said, do whatever your doctor tells you, make moderate lifestyle changes. The other was make intensive changes. And when we found that most patients became pain-free in the first few weeks. And that's really important, because for someone who can't work or make love with their spouse or play with their kids or walk across the street before the light changes without getting pain, and within a few weeks they're pain-free, that really reframes the reason for making these changes from fear of dying, which is not sustainable, as I'll talk about, to joy of living. And this is a representative patient showing the kinds of changes that we saw. In the upper left is a computer-enhanced frame from an artery that feeds the heart. And you can see that where the arrow is, there's a narrowing in the heart, in the artery of the heart, because it's clogged. A year later in the upper right, it's less clogged. And because perfusion or blood flow is a 4th power function of the diameter, even these modest changes in blockages cause huge changes in blood flow, which we actually measure using cardiac PET scans. And so on the lower left, you can see where it's blue and black, there's no blood flow. A year later in the lower right, there's maximal blood flow. So when we looked at all the arteries in all the patients, we found that there was some progression or worsening of disease in the red line after 1 year, and even more after 5 years. That's the so-called natural history of heart disease, which is to get worse and worse. But we found it's really unnatural, that instead of getting worse and worse, as you can see in the green line, the patients who made these lifestyle changes showed some reversal after 1 year, and even more reversal after 5 years. And here again, I think that the power of research is to redefine what's possible for people. And by doing so, giving, at this point, millions of people new hope and new choices that we didn't have before. We also found that there was a 400%, a 4-fold improvement in blood flow to the heart as measured by cardiac PET scans. So these are not trivial differences. And just from lifestyle changes alone, these people weren't even taking cholesterol-lowering drugs. Now, I love doing this work because it has so many far-reaching implications. And it wasn't just a few people who skewed the mean. There's plenty of seats down here, by the way, so please come on down. 99% of the patients were able to stop or reverse the progression of their heart disease, whereas only 5% of the randomized control group patients got better. And one of the interesting things we found was that the more people changed, the more they improved at any age. And I thought when I began doing this work that the younger patients who had more mild disease would do better, but I was wrong. It wasn't how old they were, it wasn't how sick they were. The more you change, the more you improve. And it wasn't just with heart disease, and as I'll share with you today, every disease we study, the more you change your lifestyle, the more you improve, at any age. And that's a very empowering message to give people, not to blame, but to empower. And also the more you change your lifestyle, the better you feel, and the better you feel, the more you want to keep doing it, because it reframes the reason for changing lifestyle of fear of preventing something bad from happening years down the road to joy and pleasure and feeling good, which is ultimately what makes this sustainable. We also found that there was a 40% reduction in cholesterol levels, comparable to what you get with a lifetime of statins or like Lipitor, but without the costs. And here again, the only side effects are good ones. So we also found that there were 2.5 times fewer cardiac events, heart attacks, strokes, bypasses, angioplasties, and stents when compared to the control group. Now, we have now over a dozen patients who were so sick with heart disease that they were told they needed a heart transplant, which is like the ultimate high-tech intervention. It costs $1.5 million. You have to be on immunosuppressive drugs the rest of your life. And you're getting your chest cut open. It's huge surgery. And there's a shortage of donors because, unlike donating blood, you have to get someone who's killed on a motorcycle or whatever, and so you have to wait for a donor. So this is one of the hospitals we've trained. Now that Medicare is covering my program, we've been training hospitals and clinics and physician groups around the country. And one of them is in South Bend, Indiana. And so this is a guy who was told he needed a heart transplant. And while waiting for a donor, he went through our program saying, you know, it'll just get me in better shape for the heart transplant. And he improved so much after just 9 weeks that he didn't need a heart transplant anymore. So I ask you, like, what's the more radical intervention here? Like people say, why are you doing this radical intervention of eat well, move more, stress less, and love more? Why don't you do something more conventional like a heart transplant? And he was able to avoid it. We have over a dozen men and women who've been able to do that. So the local CBS affiliate did a short story on that, and I just want to share that with you. It's a good overview of our work as well. It's only a couple minutes long.
Program at 2 local hospitals that's promising to undo heart disease for patients with heart trouble.
And this prescription includes no medication. Really interesting. WSB22's Kristen Dean is here. Kristen, it does though include a lot of lifestyle changes.
Yeah, but the results are amazing. Right now, the Ornish Reversal Program is offered at Memorial and Elkhart General Hospitals. It isn't easy, but patients who participate say it's worth it.
We actually were working 7 days a week for probably 3 months.
David Foster is 57. He's a Navy veteran and a retired paramedic. He and his wife are raising a beautiful 8-month-old baby girl adopted as a newborn. But in July, he was told he would need a heart transplant. What goes through your mind when someone says you need a heart transplant?
Pretty much nothing. Everything around you kind of ceases, you know. He says, you need a heart transplant. What do you think? Uh-oh, now what am I going to do?
His heart troubles had caught up with him. He had 100% blockages in his heart. That's when someone told him about the Ornish Reversal Program. Doctors say it's scientifically proven to undo heart disease.
I never mind that and there, that I was going to beat this thing. So I've never really thought about the damage. Not at all. I thought about more of what do I need to do to continue my life and change it.
The Ornish program requires patients to make major lifestyle changes. They spend 9 weeks learning how to eat a low-fat, plant-based diet. They have to exercise, undergo stress management, and participate in group support.
This is a sort of a lifestyle prescription. We're not going to be taking a pill, but we're going to modify what we do in our life, and we're going to build our life around these healthy practices so that we can enjoy a healthy life, not spend our life in fear of when the next cardiac event is coming.
Doctors say 90% of patients who complete the program continue these lifestyle changes after a year. Foster is sticking with his and recently learned his heart function has improved and he no longer needs that heart transplant.
I said, I don't think about death. I just think about the day.
I love doing this work. This is a PET scan of another patient who needed a heart transplant. And on the left, red is, this is an isotope, it's a radiolabeled sugar. The cells of the heart take up sugar as their fuel. So you can see how much of the heart is actually working. And you see how much more red there is on the right than on the left. That means a lot of the heart muscle they thought was dead or scar tissue was in fact stunned or hibernating, woke up and began to pump again. And that's why he didn't need a heart transplant anymore. I was just at UCLA last week, 2 weeks ago, and they have our reversing heart disease program there as well. And there was a physician there who had a massive heart attack, whose ejection fraction was only 11%, meaning his heart was barely pumping. And he was told he needed a heart transplant. He couldn't walk across the street. His son had to carry him up the stairs to his room because he had such bad pain. And just after 9 weeks, his heart was pumping so much better that he's working full time. He doesn't have any chest pain. He doesn't need a heart transplant. He's hiking at 7,000 feet. I mean, it's just amazing. I have to go, wow, what kind of program was that? And I was like, oh, it's mine. I forgot. It's like, it's so powerful that these simple changes, it's like you have to go, really? That you mean just eat well, move more, stress less, love more can actually cause that much improvement when someone who's that close to death? And the answer is, in many cases, yes. We then did a study with Peter Carroll, who's the chair of urology at UCSF, and the late Dr. Bill Fair, who's the chair of urology at, was the chair of urology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, to see if these same lifestyle changes could slow, stop, reverse the progression of men with early stage prostate cancer, and by extension, women with breast cancer. And we took men who had biopsy-proven prostate cancer, who were told that they needed to have surgery, but decided to do watchful waiting instead. So then we could have a true non-intervention control group, and we could then compare them. And what we found was that after just a year, the PSA levels went up or got worse in the control group, went down or got better in the experimental group, in direct proportion to the degree of lifestyle change. The more people changed, the more they improved. We found that the tumor growth in vitro was inhibited 70% versus only 9% in the control group, huge differences. And to me, one of the coolest slides, the more people change their lifestyle, the more it directly inhibited the tumor from growing. We then did MR spectroscopy, which is a newer test to actually measure the tumor activity. You can see the tumor activity shrinking along with the PSA coming down. And none of the experimental group patients needed surgery or radiation or chemo, but 6 of the control group patients did during the first year. So we wonder what some of the mechanisms might be to help explain that. So we looked at their gene expression, and we found that over 500 genes were changed in just 3 months. And in fact, and we did this with Craig Venter, and Craig and I did a dialogue at this summit conference a few days ago. We talked about this. Turning on the good genes, turning off the bad genes. And particularly turning off the bad genes that cause cancer, prostate, breast, and colon cancer, what are called the RAS oncogenes. And you can see here on the right are just different names of genes that cause cancer. On the left, in the red, mostly red is turned on. These are cancer genes that are turned on. 3 months later on the right, where it's mostly green, these are genes now turned off. And again, it's just amazing to me how quickly people can get better. Now this is a study that someone else did, Jeff Dusek at Harvard, and it shows that meditation alone can actually change your gene expression. Because sometimes people go, oh, meditation, I've got 1,000 things to do, I don't want to just sit around and do nothing, right? But it actually turns out that you're actually doing something really powerful, because it's found that along the top is control group, 8 weeks of meditation, or advanced meditation. You can see it goes from red to kind of red to green, and on the bottom from green to kind of red to red. It just shows that 8 weeks of meditation can turn on your good genes and turn off your bad genes. So it's incredibly powerful. So often people say, oh, I've just got bad genes, what can I do? And it turns out you can do a lot. Again, not to blame, but to empower, because if you're just a victim of your genes, what can you do? But it turns out that our genes are a predisposition, but our genes are not our fate. And so if you have a family history, your mother and father and sister and brothers and aunts and uncles all died early of heart disease, that means you probably need to make bigger changes than someone else might. But if you're willing to do that, you can overcome that. We then did a study with Elizabeth Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize for her pioneering work with telomeres. And telomeres are the ends of our chromosomes that regulate cellular aging. And they're like the plastic tips on the end of shoelaces that keep your shoelace from unraveling. They keep your DNA from unraveling. And it's as we get older, our telomeres get shorter. And as our telomeres get shorter, our lives get shorter, and the risk of premature death from pretty much everything goes up correspondingly. So we found that the enzyme that regulates telomeres, that lengthens and repairs them, went up by 30% in just the first 3 months. Again, just 3 months, you can actually begin to reverse aging at a cellular level. And over a 5-year period, we found that we could actually lengthen the telomeres, and in a sense, reverse aging at a cellular level, whereas the control group, they got shorter. Now, if drug X could do this, and that's all it did, it'd be a multi-billion-dollar drug. But it wasn't like there was one set of lifestyle changes for reversing heart disease, a different one for diabetes, or prostate cancer, or your genes, or your telomeres. It's the same for all of them. And I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. And we again found that more people change, the longer their telomeres got. We just began the first randomized trial to see if these same lifestyle changes can reverse Alzheimer's disease. And we're doing this in collaboration with Bruce Miller, who's the head of the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF, and we've begun that. I'm excited about this because I think it's going to work. And it's important because, as our population ages, more and more people are getting Alzheimer's. And when you lose your memories, you lose everything. And there are no good drugs for either treating or preventing Alzheimer's. And so if we can actually show that we can reverse it by making these same lifestyle changes, it'll be incredibly powerful. And if anyone's interested in getting involved in this study, let me know. It's worth pointing out that I debated Dr. Atkins a number of times before he died, it turns out of heart disease. But there's still the Atkins diet keeps resurging, it's the paleo diet, or these different kinds of approaches. And the reason why these diets work in terms of weight loss is that they're based on a half-truth. And the half-truth is that most Americans eat way too much sugar and refined carbs. And sugar and refined carbs are not a good thing to be eating. It's then, and we agreed on that, but it's what you replace them with that we differ. You don't want to replace them with you know, pork rinds and bacon and sausage and things like that. But if you can replace it with good carbs, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes in their natural forms, then you get an even greater benefit. And no study has ever shown that a high-protein, low-carb diet can reverse or prevent heart disease. In fact, this is in the New England Journal of Medicine. It shows what actually happens in your arteries. You can lose weight on an Atkins diet, but you can lose weight in lots of ways that aren't good for you, like smoking cigarettes is a good way to lose weight, or chemotherapy is a good way to lose weight. So this shows what happens not just with weight loss, but in your arteries on different diets. And you can see on the top is on a whole foods plant-based diet. They're clean, they're normal, they're flowing, they're happy. In the middle is a standard American diet. You can see they're partially clogged. And on the bottom is what happens on a high-protein, Atkins, paleo, other kinds of diet. And they're severely clogged, even if it's not necessarily reflected in weight or blood pressure or cholesterol or things like that. The cartoon says that my only consolation is that by eating us, they're killing themselves. Kind of a little early for dark humor, but anyway. And again, it's the same lifestyle program for all these different things. And the reason is that, you know, the more diseases we study and the more underlying biological mechanisms we do research on, the more reasons we have to explain, come on in, why these changes are so powerful and how quickly they can occur. And the reason is that they share common underlying biological mechanisms, kind of like chronic inflammation and apoptosis and stasis and oxidative stress and changes in angiogenesis and so on. And so we tend to think of these diseases, they're siloed. It's like prostate cancer is different than heart disease, different than breast cancer, different than diabetes. And they are to some ways, of course. But the fact that they share these same underlying biological mechanisms is why these same lifestyle changes have such far-reaching and powerful treatment effects across a wide range of diseases. And we're showing bigger changes in lifestyle, better clinical outcomes, bigger cost savings, and better adherence than anyone's ever shown. And I'm going to talk about why that is. Now, it turns out that most doctors say, oh, I can get my patients to take their Lipitor, their statins, but there's no way they're going to change their lifestyle. And yet it turns out that most patients are not taking their statins. This is from the pharma company's own data. Half to 2/3 of people who are prescribed statins like Lipitor are not taking them after just 4 to 6 months. And yet we're getting 85 to 90% adherence to our lifestyle program after a year, even though the program is only 9 weeks long. And people say, well, that's crazy. How could that be? And the reason is that having made a lot of mistakes along the way, we've learned what it is that enables people to make sustainable changes. And it's not how I was trained as a doctor. I was trying to try to scare you as much as possible. You know, if I could just scare you enough, then you'll change. And if you've ever been like in the duty-free shop in Heathrow Airport, you know, where you see the cartons of cigarettes with like, smoking will kill you, you know, or people have their faces removed, or tracheotomies. Like, if we can just scare you enough, then you won't smoke. And fear is not a sustainable motivator. In the short run, it is. I mean, you know, when someone's had a heart attack, they'll do pretty much anything their doctor says for like a month or two, but even then they get off it. But joy and pleasure are what are sustainable. And because these underlying mechanisms are so dynamic, you don't have to wait long to feel the benefits. And it reframes it from fear to joy and pleasure. Because there's no point in giving up something that you like unless you get something back that's even better and quickly. And because these mechanisms are so dynamic, most people feel so much better so quickly, it really changes that. Now, I want to show you a clip that I think will make your day. It made mine when I first saw it. There's James Cameron, the filmmaker who did Avatar and Titanic and all those great movies, Terminator, became a vegan himself about 6 or 7 years ago, mostly for environmental reasons, which we'll talk about, because global warming is caused by livestock consumption and all forms of transportation combined. And so the biggest myth about being a vegan or vegetarian is that you're kind of a wimp and you don't get enough protein, right? So he decided, let's make a film about really macho guys, like NFL athletes and mixed martial artists and things like that, who are vegan. And there's one scene which no one has seen. They sent this to me yesterday, and they were nice enough to let me show it at the Summit Conference yesterday, but I'm going to show it here as well. But don't film it, because they asked me to not do that. But just to show you how powerful and how dynamic these lifestyle changes can be. And after they shot the scene, the film crew became vegan, so it'll give you some idea.
Okay, I'm going to take you down to the camera. When I think of a manly man, I think of somebody who has strength, endurance, sexual prowess, and fertility. And in fact, what the scientific studies are showing is that the more meat men eat, the more quickly they lose their manly manhood.
After the blood test experiment with the NFL players, I asked Dr. Spitz if it was possible to conduct another test. we found 3 collegiate athletes willing and able to undergo a test of what many men consider to be their most important muscle.
So, here's a model penis.
Dr. Spitz is the lead delegate of urology for the American Medical Association. When it comes to the penis, he literally wrote the book.
Now you're going to be putting this device on yourself. And blue will go on the base of the penis. Okay, so blue is for base. And then the white one goes on at the tip of the penis, just behind the head of the penis. It knows how tight it is when the erection is starting, because it will determine, oh, it's now a larger circumference, something's happening. What we're going to look at is what effect the meal you have has on your erections that night. You're going to be eating 2 different kinds of meals. For this study, on the first night, we gave the guys burritos that had meat, beef, chicken, pork, but really high quality meats, grass-fed, organic. On the second night, we gave them very similar burritos, but we swapped out the animal portions for plant-based protein.
Really good. I thought this was gonna be nasty. I think we're eating a burrito, that would be a salad.
You told me that yesterday's burrito was actually plant-based. This was the real pork. I'll probably believe you, honestly, because it's so good.
This study is going to take advantage of a natural function that occurs in men when they sleep. Men's bodies create erections, and this occurs throughout the night while the subject is asleep. Once an erection happens, this device can sense it, and a printout is generated of how firm the erection was, how long it lasted, and how many of them there were, to see if we can see a physical effect on erections as a result of what they just ate for dinner. This is where we take a look at the results. So Mason, I'm going to give you your results first. Let you take those out. Okay. The bigger the circumference, the harder the erection. And so you'll notice that that first circle, which is the meat meal, is not as big a circle, it's not as hard an erection as that second circle, vegan meal. And now let's look at the second sheet. The second sheet is a accumulation of how many erections and for how long you had over the course of the night. So that first stubby graph is really it's not the size of your penis. It's not the size of your penis. It's how many minutes throughout the night you had erection. Wait, let's take a look at your results. Okay? And look, again, like Mason, you were more erect after the plant-based diet than the meat-based diet. Okay, how about how often you had erections? Let's go to the next one. Wow. All right, looks like the meat wasn't so good for your meat. So, that's almost a 500% difference. Blake, you ready for yours? All right, there you go. You had about a 13% change in the hardness of your erections. Okay, let's look at how many or how long you had erections for.
Show it, hang it.
Yeah. Hold that.
Bro, that's an hour.
So you guys all had a very similar response to the meat meal versus the plant meal. On average, the 3 of you, meat-based erections, less hard, narrower circumference, plant-based, more hard, wider circumference, and then how many and how long you're getting erections for. Meat-based on average about 11 and a half minutes versus almost 45 minutes on a plant-based diet, and the hour of erections you get.
I always looked at growing up, and if I saw somebody do that at a restaurant eating a big old steak, and going, oh, I need it like that. And then like I see the guy ordering a salad after it, what?
He saw it, right?
Yeah, but like that. But really, at the end of that, the guy eating the big steak
Where are you gonna take her to eat?
Veggie grills. Even though we've seen these kinds of studies, no one's ever said, after one meal, you're gonna have 5 times more erections that night than after another single kind of meal. You're gonna have a 500% increase or a 300% increase. I mean, it's all very dramatic, and to put all of this science in the context of your penis, I think this is going to wake a lot of people up. I think it's gonna wake up people who have penises, and I think it's gonna wake up people who like people who have penises.
So the idea is that it's not just your heart that gets more blood flow when you eat healthfully and manage stress and do all these things. In fact, if you have erectile dysfunction, it turns out to be that's one of the most powerful predictors of whether you have heart disease or not, because it's a systemic issue. It's not, we tend to focus on one organ or one part of the body, but these same mechanisms apply throughout the body. And one of the sites we trained is at UCLA, and there's a guy in the LAPD who went through our program. And after just 9 weeks, you can see here, this 50% blockage became almost non-existent. And the interventional cardiologist said it wasn't a blood clot or a spasm, it was an actual atherosclerotic plaque that resolved. And it just, again, the more diseases we look at, the more mechanisms we study, the more reasons we have to explain why these simple changes are so powerful and how quickly they can occur. We found that most people become pain-free in just a few weeks. And again, that's an incredibly powerful motivator. So we wondered whether these same lifestyle changes could actually save money. And we found they save lots of money. Now, from a prevention standpoint, it's harder to show cost savings because you have to follow people for long periods of time. But it turns out that 86% of the $3.2 trillion that we spend each year on healthcare, which is mostly sick care, are for chronic diseases that are largely preventable and even reversible through changing lifestyle. So if we want to get the triple aim of making better care available to more people at lower costs, this is the way to do it. Now, it turns out that 5% of people account for 80% of the healthcare costs. Okay, and many of you have companies and you're probably self-insured, so these savings accrue right to your bottom line. And heart disease is the most common and therefore the most expensive. And so by focusing on the 5% that account for 80% of the costs, we're able to show dramatic cost savings in the first year. And we did the first study with Mutual of Omaha, where we found that most people who were told they needed a standard angioplasty were able to safely avoid it by changing their lifestyle. And they found they saved almost $30,000 per patient in the first year. Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield was not only covering our program, but providing it in 24 sites in West Virginia, Nebraska, and Pennsylvania, 3 of the more challenging parts of the country to get people to change their lifestyle. And they cut their costs in half in the first year compared to a control group. And when they looked at the subset of people that they'd spent the most on, the ones that they spent at least $25,000 on in the previous year, they cut their costs by 400% in the first year. So for those of you who work with or who have large companies and you're generally self-insured and self-administered, and you can cut your healthcare costs by 400% in the first year, and we're talking about $3.2 trillion in healthcare costs, that's a lot of money. And so in this Highmark demonstration project, we found every metric we've studied, people got better. And these are, remember, the program's 9 weeks long. In this case, it was 12 weeks long. So we studied at the beginning, after the program was over, 12 weeks, and then a year later, when they weren't getting the program. And we found continued weight loss, a 19-pound average weight loss. This is actually better weight loss data than Weight Watchers, but we're not focusing on weight, we're focusing on health. And then everything is better, including but not limited to weight loss. The ability to exercise on a treadmill went up and stayed up. The old joke, am I going to live longer? Is it just going to seem longer if I change my lifestyle? Actually, the quality of life improves dramatically in these patients. Systolic blood pressure shows sustained reductions, so does diastolic blood pressure. Even though we're getting people off their medications, blood sugar comes down and stays down. And depression scores are cut in half. The other real epidemic is depression. It turns out that depression is more prescriptions were written for antidepressants last year than for any other category of drugs, because there are a lot of depressed people out there. And we can cut those scores by 50%. Now, we would have shown even bigger improvements, except for the fact that their medications, people got off or reduced their medications for their blood pressure, their cholesterol, other things like that. And so these improvements are actually even better had they kept the medications constant. Now, through my nonprofit institute, we train hospitals and clinics around the country. We got these same amazing outcomes, but a number of them closed down because we didn't have reimbursement. So the painful lesson for me was that if it's not reimbursable, then it's not sustainable. And so that set me on a 16-year journey to get Medicare to cover our program. I had no idea it'd be so hard. We had Bill Clinton when he was president, Newt Gingrich who was Speaker of the House, 20 members of the Senate, 30 members of the House, heads of all the major organizations. And still, it took 16 years. Although when I talk to people in government, they say only 16 years, so I guess it's all relative. But that was a real game changer, because if you change reimbursement, you change medical practice and even medical education. And so our approach is to have the doctor as quarterback. Most doctors are not happy practicing medicine these days. In fact, studies show that most doctors wouldn't recommend medicine as a career for their kids. Because if you have to see a new patient every 8 to 10 minutes, you don't really have time to talk about the things that matter most. You don't have time, you basically go through the electronic medical record, you listen to their heart and lungs, go to the problem list, write a prescription, they're out the door. It's not fun for doctors or patients. And so we're creating a new paradigm where we have 72 hours with patients, but very little of the doctor's time is actually spent doing it. It's under his or her auspices, but it's done mainly by the nurse, the yoga teacher, the exercise physiologist, the dietitian, or the psychologist. We also are doing 12-day residential retreats for those who are interested in the Bay Area. We have one the last week in January, the first week in February, and Medicare will pay for that as well. So we can democratize the retreat experience, and not just for the affluent, but for everyone who needs it. And it also allows us to reclaim our role not just as technicians, but as healers. You know, Vinod Khosla famously once said that if we doctors are just a collection of algorithms, we're going to get replaced by an iPhone app before long, because computers do algorithms better. But we're more than that. And so this enables us to have the time with people to really work with at the levels that are really important. Let me just, in that spirit, let me talk a little bit about what we've learned that enables people to make sustainable changes in their lives. And it's not fear of dying, it's joy of living. If it's pleasurable, it's sustainable, and if it's meaningful, it's sustainable. And so I ask people, you know, why do you want to live longer? Because we assume that everybody wants to live longer. Here in Silicon Valley, close to Silicon Valley anyway, there's a lot of talk about wanting to live forever and really live as long as possible. And certainly living long is a good idea. But if you're depressed, I was suicidally depressed when I was in college. That's how I got interested in doing all this work. And if you tell someone who's depressed that they're going to live longer, they kind of go, well, I'm just trying to get through the day, you know. And if you say, why do you smoke, and why do you overeat, and why do you drink too much, and why do you abuse substances, and why do you abuse opioids, and why do you work all the time, they say, and I say, because these behaviors seem so maladaptive, and they say, they're not maladaptive, they're very adaptive, because they help us deal with our emotional pain, or loneliness, or depression, or isolation. And so I've had people say things like, I've got 20 friends in this pack of cigarettes, and they're always there for me, and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me? Or food fills that void, or fat coats my nerves and numbs the pain, or video games distract me from the pain, or working all the time is a more socially acceptable way of distracting me from my pain, or you know, opioids, or whatever it is. And so it's not enough to just focus on fear. What's really liberating, and what enables people to make sustainable changes, if it's meaningful, if it feels good, if you feel like you're freely choosing to do it, and if you have a lot of love and support. When people feel loved and supported and cared for, they're much more likely to make and maintain lifestyle choices that are life-enhancing than ones that are self-destructive. And fear is a great motivator for about a month, you know, but because it's very visceral and primal. But it's not sustainable for most people. What's sustainable is joy and pleasure and meaning, as we talked about. And that information is important, but it's not usually sufficient to get most people to change their lifestyle. If it were, nobody would smoke. It's not like I tell somebody, hey, did you know smoking is bad for you? They go, gee, I didn't know that. I'll quit today. It's like everybody knows. But again, you have to work not just the information, not just the behavior, but with these deeper emotional issues that really are deeper than that. And what I found so interesting is that study after study has shown that people who are lonely and depressed are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely, 3 to 10 times, than those who have a sense of love and connection and community. And I don't know anything, including smoking, that has that big an impact. And so I just want to review with you just a few of these studies. I wrote a book about this many years ago called Love and Survival that reviewed what were then hundreds and now thousands of studies that people who are lonely and depressed are many times more likely to get sick and die prematurely from all causes. This is one study that found that after a heart attack, those that were depressed were 4 times more likely to be dead 6 months later than those that weren't, independent of their diet, their cholesterol, their blood pressure, all the usual things. At Duke, they found that those that were unmarried and had no confidant, who were lonely and isolated, in fact, were 50% likely to be dead after 5 years versus 15%, more than a 3-fold difference in mortality. You can see the survival curves at the bottom. Those are the ones who are unmarried and no confidant. Because again, loneliness and depression kill people. On the other hand, love actually enhances your immune function. I don't know how they got this through the Human Studies Committee, but this was done by Sheldon Cohen in the Journal of the American Medical Association. They did a study where they dripped rhinovirus, cold virus, into people's noses. So 100% of the patients got infected with a cold virus, but not everybody got sick. And they found that the more social interactions they had, the more love and support they had, the fewer signs and symptoms of the cold. There was a fourfold difference between those that had the love and support and those that didn't in terms of the frequency of actually getting sick. And in a more even severe way, men and women who are HIV positive, this was done by Margaret Chesney at UCSF, men and women who are HIV positive that were depressed had more than twice the likelihood of developing AIDS and dying from it as those who didn't. So anything that brings us together is healing. This conference is healing. It brings people together. Anything that creates intimacy is healing. Even the word healing comes from the root to make whole. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit, to yoke, to unite, union. These are actually old ideas that we're rediscovering here. And so our work is really, the support groups in our program are not just helping people stay on the diet. They're really creating a safe environment where people can let down their emotional defenses and talk openly and authentically about what's really going on in their lives without fear that someone's going to judge or criticize or abandon them. And you can only be intimate to the degree you can be emotionally vulnerable. You can open your heart, if you will. And you can only do that to the degree you feel safe. So our support groups are based on the idea that you're safe. And what you say in the group stays in the group, that it's all about focusing on connecting at a deep level with people in ways that are really authentic. Now, David Spiegel did an amazing study that was in the Lancet, where he took women who had metastatic breast cancer, and they both groups got he randomly divided into two groups. Both groups got the same chemo and radiation and surgery, but one group met together for an hour and a half once a week for a year in the same kind of support group that we're talking about, very open and loving and supportive. Just did it for 1 year. 5 years later, he told me he almost fell off his chair when he actually looked at the data. Those women lived twice as long. Now, a skeptic might say, oh, come on, give me a break, please. Talking about my feelings, it can help me live longer if I've got cancer, come on. But it does, because we are touchy-feely creatures. People sometimes would say, oh, Dean, your program is so California, it's so touchy-feely, and I'd get defensive, and I'd say, no, look at our angiograms and our PET scans. And finally one day I said, it is touchy-feely because we are touchy-feely creatures. We're creatures of community. And that's what makes it work so well. And so when you see these kinds of data, you can see what kind of a powerful impact it has. Now, Nicholas Christakis at Harvard found that if we are so interconnected that if your friends are obese, you're 45% more likely to be obese yourself. If it's your friends' friends, you're 25% more likely. And if it's your friends' friends' friends, you're 10% more likely, even if you've never met them. And it's not just obesity, it's pretty much everything. Because we are social creatures, we're creatures of community. And that can be used to help, and it can be used to harm, depending on how what's behind it. And as an example of that, at Harvard Medical School, they gave medical students a questionnaire just rating how close they were to their parents. And 35 years later, based on this one questionnaire, they found that those that rated their parents low in warmth and love, and closeness, had 100% of them had major illnesses in midlife, compared to less than half that rated their parents' relationship as close. Now, why is that so important? Because how we develop relationships later in life is really a function of how we were raised, unless you've done a lot of work on yourself to try to change that. So if you grew up in a family that wasn't very loving or close or warm, and you're in a relationship with someone who really has a great capacity for intimacy, it's uncomfortable, so you tend to select for people who mirror your own capacity for intimacy. And that's why it's so important. Knowing that, we can change that. There are things we can do to learn how to be more intimate and open with other people. This is also seen in the military. It turns out that more soldiers in the last 20 years have died by suicide than in combat. And so I've had the privilege of giving the matriculation lecture at this place called the U.S. Army War College, which I'd never even heard of before I was asked to speak there. And it's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it's where they train the future generals and joint chiefs of staff from all branches of the military. And so I thought, gosh, we've got a problem here. If I go there as kind of the wuss California doctor, I'm not going to have much street cred. So I'd given a TED talk with former four-star General Stan McChrystal. And I said, if you could give a little short video on the power of love, that would have a lot more credibility. So he did. And then the following year, I asked former four-star Admiral Eric Olson, who was in charge of all special forces worldwide, all the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and Delta Force and Green Berets and so on, did the same thing. So let me play this for you. It's just a couple minutes long. I find it pretty inspiring.
Hi, I'm Stanley Crystal, and thanks for being here today. In fact, I want to thank Dean for letting me be here today. This is the second time I've been able to participate from afar into what I think is his discussion of a really important subject. You know, we're going to talk today about the power of love. Soldiers love things. They love their truck, they love their dog, they love their kids, they love their wife. But as I grew up as a soldier, it was really uncommon to talk about loving what you do or loving other soldiers. But if you think about why people do extraordinary things, why on the battlefield soldiers will sacrifice themselves, why they will make extraordinary efforts not to let down a comrade on the left or right, it's got nothing to do with fear or coercion from their corporal or sergeant or officers. It has everything to do with commitment and wanting to have a relationship with people and with an organization in which they feel like they've given part of themselves so that they can, in fact, feel like they are a very important part of that team. So when we talk about the power of love, I think it's the most powerful things that move soldiers. Again, you're not going to stand in a sports bar and talk about how much you love each other. I love you, man. But when people put it on, the equipment, when they really have got to do difficult things, I think that's what makes people operate. I think that's what makes people give. I think that's what makes organizations strong. Thank you, Dean. All the best.
It was a little Dr. Strangelove-like to talk about the power of love in the Army War College, but I thought it was powerful. That the idea is that love is more powerful than fear, that the light drives out the darkness. And you know, especially what we're seeing in politics this day with the politics of fear and so on, I think it's really more timely than ever. The last thing I want to talk about, and we'll open up for questions, is there's another side to why we found it enables people to make sustainable changes, and that is, you're like, why have any limitations if you don't have to? Why not eat everything you want? Why not do everything you want? Why care? And to look at diet, for example, all spiritual traditions have dietary guidelines, and they're all radically different from each other. In one religion you can eat this, but not that, or certain days of the week, or certain times of day, or certain months, whatever. And it's like, you know, is God confused? I don't know. But the idea is that whatever the intrinsic benefit of eating or not eating certain things, that choosing not to do something that you otherwise can do imbues those choices with meaning. And if it's meaningful, then it's sustainable. So, for example, it can make it sacred in the sense of the most special, the most fun, the most erotic, the most exciting, the most powerful, the most wonderful, you know. And so rather than it being deprived, it really reframes that as something different. Ramakrishna was an Indian teacher 100 years ago, and he was talking about, you could dig a lot of, he was talking about choosing a spiritual teacher, but I think it's also true about, you know, relationships, that, you know, why not have sex with everybody? I mean, it's not a moral issue. For me, it's more what really brings the most pleasure and fun. And he used the analogy of you can dig, you know, one deep well and reach the wellspring, or a lot of shallow wells and never reach water. But the idea is that, sorry, let me go back here, is that great music or art or science or anything is about being truly innovative as opposed to imitative. And if you're just trying to recreate an experience, that's imitative. So if you're having a date with your loved one and you want to try to recreate an experience, that's fun. But if you're open to all degrees of freedom and all possibilities, then you can have experiences that you've never had before. And by definition, you can't try to create an experience you've never had because you don't know what that feels like. And so what I'm finding in my own personal life and my wife is that by being in a totally committed monogamous relationship, it allows that sense of safety, which then allows that sense of intimacy, which allows the sense of, like, let's just be open to all possibilities and all degrees of freedom when we come together. And then we find that we have these experiences that neither one of us has ever even imagined, much less experienced. And it's incredibly powerful. And so, again, it's not like this is better or worse or right or wrong. It's just like this provides a greater sense of freedom, that rather than being viewed as the ball and chain, it's like, oh, this is what enables me to have experiences that are so intensely pleasurable that I never would have even dreamed about before. So what I gain is so much more than what I give up. Now, there was a study that was done of millions of Twitter feeds, and they found, which I guess is particularly relevant in today's political environment, and they found that language patterns, the one predictor in all these millions of Twitter feeds that was the most predictor of disease, and particularly heart disease, was chronic anger. And so, you know, I don't know if Twitter feeds that have a lot of anger these days, any political relevance, but anyway, it's just something to think about. And to me, real spiritual teachers are really about how to live a joyful, wonderful life, not out of fear, but out of joy and pleasure. The Dalai Lama says, be kind whenever possible, and it's always possible, that kind of thing. And again, it's talking about living without preconceptions, because it's not just how long we live, it's really more important to me is how well we live. And when I was in college, I learned I could take all the meaning out of something. Who cares, so what, nothing matters, big deal, all that. But I also learned that one of the ways you can actually create meaning is by choosing not to do certain things. So if you say, I can't eat everything I want, that's not sustainable. If you say, I'm choosing not to eat certain things so that I can watch my kids grow up, so I can make love better, so I can dance at my kid's wedding, so I can go back to work, or whatever it happens to be, that's what makes these things sustainable. And one way of looking at meaning, and I was talking to like 3,000 millennials yesterday at the Summit Conference, is that, you talk to millennials about living longer, they think they're immortal anyway. But if you say, did you know that what's good for you is good for the planet, that more global warming is caused by livestock consumption than all forms of transportation combined. And it's so easy to feel like, what can I do as one person? Well, what you eat every day has a direct impact on that. Just have a meatless Monday or whatever. You don't have to be vegetarian. And likewise, it takes 14 times more energy to make a pound of meat-based protein than plant-based protein. There's enough food today to feed everyone in the world. No one need go hungry. So when you can really appeal to that part of people, it makes those choices and what they eat every day meaningful and therefore sustainable. And finally, meditation is something that can manage stress. But the ancient swamis and rabbis and priests and monks and nuns and all that didn't discover meditation to unclog your arteries or lower your blood pressure or those kinds of things, even though they can do that. They're really powerful tools for quieting down our mind and body to experience more of an inner sense of peace and joy and well-being, and ultimately transcendence. And it's a very different definition. I was trained as a doctor to view health as something you have to get from outside of you, or the whole advertising industry, that happiness is something you get from outside of you. And what happens is when you meditate and you quiet down your mind and you feel more peaceful, that the meditation didn't bring you to that state, but rather that was already there before. That's our natural state, is generally to be peaceful and happy and healthy. But when we disturb that, we create dis-ease, or we're fine until we define ourselves and get caught up in all these definitions. And politically, when we define other groups of people as being fundamentally different than us, those Muslims or those Mexican rapists or whatever, then you can do bad things to them because they're different than you. But what meditation ultimately gives you, in whatever spiritual or secular way you do it, is that sense of transcendence. That on one level we're separate, on another level we're part of something larger that connects us all. And so being able to have that double vision to see, yeah, we're separate, but we're also interconnected in the ways we've been talking about. And that all the spiritual traditions that Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy that you see in all religions and all spiritual paths, once you get past the rituals that people kill each and fight and kill each other over, altruism and forgiveness and compassion and love flow naturally from that state of realizing how interconnected we are. And so, for me, this work is really a conspiracy of love. That on the one hand, it's fun to be able to show that people can live longer and you can save money and you can reverse all these different conditions, but to what end? We're all going to die. The mortality rate is still, 100% as one per person. So again, these are things that help us use the experience of suffering as a doorway for transforming our lives to make it so much more joyful and meaningful. And yes, we'll probably live longer too, but that's not the primary goal. The goal is to live the happiest and most joyful and fun life that we can. And for me, in my limited experience, that's why I love doing this work so much. So let me stop here, and we've got about 15 or 20 minutes to have any questions or comments or dialogue. So we have mics we can go around. If you just raise your hand and they'll bring you a mic, and that way everybody can hear your questions. So any questions or comments? And thanks for coming again so early this morning to let me share this work with you.
Hi, this is Neha. What are some specific ways of boosting your immunity?
Everything we've been talking about. We know that emotional stress causes your immune system to go down, especially loneliness and depression. That if you eat a plant-based diet, it enhances your immunity. Exercise enhances your immunity. Up to a point, if you do marathons and triathlons, it actually, at least for a while, decreases your immunity. But in general, moderate exercise increases it. And anything that creates love and intimacy enhances your immunity as well. So that's just a good example of that. Whatever mechanism we're looking at, in this case immune function, that each of these four components has a direct effect on it. Anybody get the mic?
So,
Right behind you.
first, thanks for a great work.
Thank you.
Secondly, just a couple of questions. One is, some people think that being on a pescatarian diet is better than being on a red meat poultry diet. What are your thoughts about that? And then secondly, do you have enough data now to begin to quantify the impact of the Ornish program on longevity?
The first question is, yes, fish is definitely better than, I mean, if you had to rank order them, processed meats are the worst, then regular meats, then chicken, then fish, then plant-based. I wrote a book called The Spectrum that was based on the finding that the more you change, the more you improve. And so if you don't have a life-threatening condition, if you say, I'm not ready to be a vegan or vegetarian, just say, okay, to the degree I move in that direction, there's a corresponding benefit. If you indulge yourself one day, eat healthier the next. The whole language of behavioral change has this kind of, often has this fascist quality to it. The language of like patient compliance, it's like bending someone's will, and I cheated on my diet, once you call foods good or bad, it's a very small step to saying I'm a bad person because I eat bad food, and then I might as well just finish the pint of ice cream or whatever. So to the degree you move in that direction, there's a corresponding benefit. If you have a life-threatening condition like heart disease, you really do need to make big changes, sustainably big changes to get reversal. But for most people, it's the ounce of prevention and the pound of cure. We don't know yet about longevity, but that's over longer periods of time, the larger groups of people will be able to answer that question. So why don't you give the mic to the next person so they'll be ready to go. Okay, go ahead.
So I'm wondering if you've looked at parenting at all and kids' diets and things you do. I'm a parent of a 3-year-old who's a picky eater. I'm a recovering very picky eater myself, and so I can empathize with her and what you recommend there.
Well, with kids, when you can introduce them to foods when they first are eating solid foods, there's a period where they begin to prefer those foods later in life. And so there's like an imprinting that can occur when you can feed foods like that early. It's also important to make sure kids get some of the omega-3 fatty acids that you find either in flaxseed oil or fish oil, because it can help them be more calm. It helps reduce things like attention deficit disorders. It enables them to, some studies show that if a woman who's pregnant takes them, that it can increase their child's IQ by 7 to 10 points, just by that alone. But I've also learned that at any age, even more than being healthy, people want to feel free and in control. And so when my son was 3, I said to him, as he's a really strong-willed little boy, I don't know where he got that from, but I'd say, this is what we eat in our house, and this is why, but nobody can tell you what to eat, not even me, and I'm your dad, and I know more about food than a lot of people because your body is your temple and you control it. Because I knew that if I got into this power struggle with him, he'd end up with an eating disorder, which is really all about that. And so, if he didn't like something, then we'll make it together, that kind of thing. Now he's 16, he's almost 17. When he hit 15, he decided he was going to become a major carnivore after being a vegetarian his whole life, because it was like, that's what you're supposed to do when you're a teenager, is rebel. I figured it's better than that than heroin or whatever, so, go for it, But in general, if you can introduce foods when they're younger, they begin to prefer those foods later in life.
So is the thinking changing? Thank you, first of all. Is the thinking changing about low-carb diets and Atkins diets and so forth? Is there a shift that you see in terms of the popularity?
Well, it's occurring in kind of a bipolar way in every sense of the word. Among physicians and healthcare professionals, there's a growing consensus that eating red meat is not a good idea. In the general public, unfortunately, there's always the tendency to tell people what they want to hear, and they'll put butter on the cover of Time magazine or whatever, because the media, as you all talked about here, is hurting. That those media models are becoming disrupted, and people are looking for readers and subscribers and clicks and so on. And it's not just with general media, but it's true in even medical journals. Medical journals have this thing called impact factor, which is like when you write an article, how often did it get picked up in the media worldwide? And so they're always looking for telling people what they want to hear. So if you tell somebody, eating a plant-based diet is healthy, it's like, oh, that's kind of boring. If you say butter is back, put it on the cover of Time, that was one of their biggest selling issues. So you have to kind of read all these things with a grain of salt is probably the wrong term here, but you get the idea. Yeah.
So thank you so much. You have really a theory of the world. It involves lots of components. But I wanted to bring one part, and that has to do with output, especially creative output. not really anchoring what I'm going to say in the perception of art is coming from the Romantic period, in which you have to be unhappy to produce and it's you against the world. But there are enough things in there that people who are creative grew up in challenging environments and that kind of thing. So have you connected any of these things with the ability of people to do something transcendent, creative in their lives?
Well, I think this myth of the unhappy artist is sometimes that's true, because out of pain can come a lot of motivation to try to understand that or transform that, and some people do that through art, which is very powerful. But you can also, there are a lot of great artists out there who are really happy and joyful. So I think that you don't certainly have to be suffering to be an artist. There's a song that you have to suffer to sing the blues, and maybe there's some truth to that, but I don't know. I think that the creative process to me is much more based on the willingness to see with beginner's mind, with Zen mind, to see without preconceptions. I worked my way through school as a photographer, and I studied photography with a man named Gary Winogrand, who was one of the great photographers of the 20th century. He was an amazing teacher, and he put a picture on the wall and said, "What do you see?" And people say, "Oh, I see this or that." I say, "Well, how do you know someone doesn't have a gun right outside the frame? Or how do you know this isn't happening? How do you know that?" To just challenge us to really think about what our preconceptions are. And it really taught me that nobody has a monopoly on truth. And so the more perspectives or paradigms I can see things through, there's a sense of chaos that comes when you try to see things through the more than one paradigm, because the paradigm provides a sense of order to things. But if you can try to see things from as many different vantage points and perspectives as you can, that gets us much more into the innovation rather than the imitative. And to me, great art is truly innovative, or great science, or great music, or great lovemaking, or great anything. Yes.
Two things. One, you haven't said anything about dairy. I'm curious about that. And then second, just the general economics of a plant-based diet at a simple sort of baseline level compared to, say, a traditional American diet. What does it mean to the the socioeconomic sort of the impact of a middle American?
Well, this is basically a third world diet. This is the way people ate when they couldn't afford meat and dairy and things like that. And so what you see is other countries are starting to eat like us and live like us and now die like us. And I was in Dalian, China with the World Economic Forum speaking there last year. And 30, 50 years ago, heart disease was as rare there as malaria is here, and now they've kind of embraced our way of eating. There was a great article in the New York Times last week on in Buenos Aires, it was in Bolivia, I think, where Nestle and other companies are coming in. It's just we're pardon me? Brazil, thank you. We're just exporting our disease, our chronic diseases, and it's completely avoidable. So, so you can eat this way a lot cheaper. When we talk about the economic impact, when we spent $3.2 trillion last year on healthcare, which is really sick care, and we can reduce most of that, then the economic benefits can be huge. And as I mentioned before, in a corporation or in your personal life, those cost savings occur very quickly.
Going back to the discussion of turning on and off genes, there might be good genes or bad genes, how well do we understand the mechanism by which that happens from either food or medicine?
Yeah, they're a good question. There's things called histone and non-histone proteins and methylation that are act like switches that turn the genes off and on. And they're intensely responsive to diet and lifestyle. And so when I talk about changing your genes, you're not really changing your genes, you're changing the expression of those genes. But if you turn off a gene that causes prostate or breast or colon cancer, and functionally you're changing those genes.
I'm not trying to take us to all the food groups, but increasingly I'm being told by doctors, friends, and others that meat is an issue, but sugar is as big an issue in things like heart disease and diabetes is epidemic among some populations. So I got here a little late, so maybe I missed it, but was there any conversation about sugar, particularly added sugar to the diet?
Yeah, that's what I talked about at the very beginning, which is that this is a diet that's low in refined carbs and sugar, and low in fat, and low in animal protein. So they're all important. The problem comes when people say, oh, it's all sugar, and eat grass-fed beef and it doesn't matter, or eat whatever, that it's all this or it's all that. And it's not all anything. It's not even all just diet. It's all these things that we've been talking about. And so yes, when you cut out sugar from your diet, you're going to lose weight, you're going to have improvements, but you'll have even more improvements, and you'll have an even better sense of well-being if you make additional changes beyond just that. So thank you for your question.
Sorry, we are going to have.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I'll be right back.